we were going through our series on the discussion of Wilayah, and in our first few sessions we tried to understand as best as possible what this Wilayah actually means. And what Ayatollah Khamenei says is, if you look at the Quran, if you look at the most basic meaning of what Wilayah means, you reach the conclusion that it is equated to having an attachment. In and of itself, whether this attachment is good or bad, doesn't matter. Wilayah is not necessarily good, it's not necessarily bad. It just means attachment in that root, in its most simple and basic meaning. After that, we saw that there were different dimensions to Wilayah. There was this horizontal Wilayah, which we had the tawfiq to speak about, in which we looked at the attachment which exists between our peers, our friends, our brothers, our sisters, and the importance of that. And then we hinted towards another dimension of Wilayah which exists, which is the vertical Wilayah, in which you're looking at the attachment between the people and the leadership. So that structure going from down to up and up to down, as opposed to on the same level. Another thing that we touched upon was the importance of understanding that when you're looking at Wilayah, when you're looking at this attachment which should exist, it needs to be understood through looking at, or it can best be understood by looking at the detachment that you need to have as well. In reality, you can't have true attachment to one another unless you have a detachment to everything that is that can potentially pull you apart. The example that's usually used is that of a candle. That you can't love the light of a candle unless you have a negative feeling towards the wind or the water or the dust that can blow that flame away. True love for that candle, true attachment to that candle can only exist if you understand what you're supposed to have a detachment to as well. In our discussion of vertical Wilayah, I understand that there was a small miscommunication, and there was another program that was taking place. I think someone's marriage. Congratulations to who that person was. In which we touched upon, in that session we touched upon vertical Wilayah. So I'm not going to go into details of what we discussed over there. However, I just wanted to mention a couple of examples which summarize, what we had spoken of, and then hopefully we can move on to the next topic, which is looking at not the Wilayah of the divine, but the Wilayah of the Taghut, right? Of the non-divine, and what that exactly means. If you guys remember, we mentioned this example of recognizing the Shia movement as that pure stream of water which starts from on top of the mountains and goes through this journey. And in that journey it has to face different obstacles. It has to go through caves, it has to go through dirt, it has to go through trees and leaves and so on and so forth. But through all of this journey, that water remains pure. And we said that the thing which keeps that water pure throughout this journey is the attachment that each of those particles have to each other. And also there is this vertical attachment which is guiding that water through all of these challenges and making sure it's still going in the right direction, making sure it's still flowing, and so on and so forth. When we look at the Shia movement, or the movement of the lovers of the Ahlul Bayt, we try to use that as an example. Through all the difficulties that the movement of the lovers of the Ahlul Bayt went through, it was ultimately because of the attachment that they had to one another that helped them survive, and it was the attachment that community had to its leadership, to the Imams of the time and the representatives of the Imams of the time, that kept them alive, surviving, and so strong that they were able to form the foundations of the strength of the lovers of the Ahlul Bayt that you see developing right now. The main point that we want to take out from this vertical wilayah, this attachment that should exist between the people and the leadership, is the quality of this attachment. What is it supposed to be? Is it sufficient for this relationship, this attachment, to be to the level that we just know who they are? We just know who the leadership is? Is it sufficient for us just to have an emotional attachment towards them? Or is something more than this expected? I mentioned this before, but one of the examples one of the scholars uses is that he says sometimes it feels like the relationship we have with the leadership, the relationship that we have with the representatives of the Imam of the time, for example, the relationship we have with the divine symbols of the divine movement, is the same relationship we have with the football team that we support. In the sense that when it does something good, we clap and we're happy, right? And then when something bad happens to it, we get slightly upset. But you're clapping and you're being happy in front of a TV. Does that actually have any effect on that team? Does that clapping or being happy actually have any effect on you, on this journey that you're supposed to be going on through this life? Is that the relationship which is expected between you and the leaders or the divine symbols of the divine movement that we spoke of? Or is it meant to be something more than that? An example that Ayatollah Khamenei uses in the book, I find this such a beautiful example. Actually, to be specific, he uses the example of a factory that makes carpets. I had a chance to go in Mashhad to a factory that makes books. So I saw this firsthand, so I'm going to use the same example he used, but for a book factory. If you guys have not been to a book factory, sounds boring, but trust me, it's not. It's actually pretty cool how a book comes together. But what you see happening in this factory is you see these different sections working on different things to try and bring to fruition this end product, which is supposed to be a specific book. You see one section working on creating the templates for all of the pages. You see one section working on getting the correct colors of the inks for those templates. You see another section working on getting that printed onto paper. You see another section which is working on cutting those papers according to the size. Then at the same time you have a section working on the cover of the book, the design of the book, the material that's required of the book. And then eventually there's a section where that's responsible for binding the whole book together. Now you see this attachment which exists between them. And at the same time there's an owner of this book factory. The one who actually sets, like, look, this is the objective that we're trying to achieve. These are the guidelines of how we're going to do it, and these are some rules and principles. Imagine if the relationship between the workers and the owner of the book factory was one of just emotional attachment. Okay? So he's asking you to do something and you're like, he's such a nice guy. I can tell you so many fadail, so many virtues of this owner of the book factory. I can, well, forget the vices. You big him up so much. And he's such a beautiful, I love him. It's like, oh, so, you're in the department which binds the book together. Are you actually going to bind the book together? He said, no, but I love him. Imagine if the only attachment that existed between the workers in the different sections and the owner was just that emotional attachment. And they didn't actually follow what he wanted them to do, would the end result actually come about? At the same time, if they just followed and had no emotional attachment, okay, there's a reason why emotions exist within us, right? They're supposed to be forms of motivation so that we actually have this like passion, this drive to actually get things done. So imagine if we just had this very dry, cold relationship where instructions came and we followed. Like, I don't know, like an IKEA guidebook. Imagine your boss just being an IKEA guidebook with instructions of how to put something together, and that's it, right? Again, like, you wouldn't really go ahead and, how long can you stay motivated for? But if you had both that emotional attachment and you had that following, then the end product will be much more likely to be achieved. We see throughout history that whenever one side or the other, or certain other factors, were not taken care of in this relationship between the people and the leadership, the movement suffered, the divine movement as a whole suffered. But whenever these factors were taken care of, the emotional attachment, the understanding of who the leader is, the understanding of his instructions and so on and so forth, and the actual following, right, you saw that the movement was thriving. So the point that we want to get from, there were other things that were mentioned as well, but the specific point that I want you to take away from the discussion we had previously on this vertical wilayah is that this attachment which exists between us and the divine symbols of the movement, this attachment has to be more than just an emotional attachment. It has to be more than just a following instructions attachment. It has to be, in one way, it has to be a mixture of these two. In one way, you need to make sure that I can't open up this discussion because simply it would just take too much time, and I do want to move on from the vertical wilayah section. But yes, the quality, focus on what the quality of this attachment should be between yourselves and the divine symbols of the movement. I'm hoping that I'm leaving it open enough. If you do have specific questions, we can potentially address them. But I'm going to leave that over here. So we have that horizontal wilayah. In the horizontal wilayah, we only spoke about the attachment. We didn't speak about the detachment side of things. So, okay, we should be attached in what way? Why is it important? We looked at that. But we didn't see the detachment side of things. Over here, however, after speaking about vertical wilayah, I actually want to speak about the detachment from the non-divine Taghut. It's not the right word to use, but the Quran puts it very simply for us, and it's scary actually in a way how the Quran puts it, because it makes it much more difficult for us in a way. The Quran says, look, you have the wilayah of Allah, and it would be really easy if it just said, okay, you have the wilayah of Allah, and then you have like the wilayah of the Taghut. Right? That would be easy, or easier, right? It still wouldn't be easy, but it would be easier. But what we understand from the Quran, what we understand from Tawheed in general, is that you have wilayah of Allah, and everything that is not the wilayah of Allah is the wilayah of the Taghut. Simple as that, full stop. You either have the wilayah of Allah, and everything else is the wilayah of the Taghut. This has huge implications. Huge implications. Question: what is the Taghut? To put it very simply, Taghut or the Tawaghit is a reference to all those things, all those entities and things which take a person away from the commands of Allah. Okay, everything that takes you away from it. Remember we had that discussion how the only thing that matters is your relationship with the divine movement and the divine symbols of that movement. And the reason why your relationship with the divine movement is important is because that's what connects you to the divine symbols of the movement and ultimately Allah as well. That is the wilayah of Allah. Anything other than this becomes the wilayah of the Taghut. So anything or any entity, institution, so on and so forth, that takes a person away from the divine symbols of the movement or the divine movement itself is recognized as being a Taghut. Just like shaitan should not be mistaken for a name that specifically belongs to Iblis, Taghut is not something which is it's not a pronoun which is specific to a person. Because generally, I guess depending on which circle you belong to, but generally, when you mention Taghut in Islam, the first thing that the people think of is Fir'aun. Right? There's verses in the Quran which specifically say that he did Tagha, right? Tagha and Taghut have the same root word. But the stress here is that, look, don't see this as an individual that existed once upon a time. Don't see shaitan as being that specific Iblis that existed once upon a time. Let me ask you guys a question, make it a bit more interactive and gives me the chance to drink some tea. Do you guys remember what the definition of shaitan was? Anyone? I'll give you a clue. We said shaitan is on one side, your nafs is on the other side. What differentiates the two? Make a guess.
Shaitan is all those external factors who is going to take you away from Allah and the message. And the nas is basically all the internal stuff who is going to take you away from the message.
Okay. Proof that silence is a sign of wisdom. Yeah, that's true. Did the sister say that? Yeah? We've been through this discussion before. What the brother said was that shaitan is a reference to all those external forces which push us away from the divine, and your nafs is a reference to all those internal forces and pressures which take you away from the divine. Okay. What's interesting is in the Quran, shaitan and Taghut are presented almost as the same thing. Right? Like it's almost used interchangeably. So like there's a verse in the Quran, Surah Nisa, verse number 76. Those who have faith fight in the way of Allah, and those who are faithless fight in the way of fake gods. Okay, over here the Arabic is الذين آمنوا يقاتلون في سبيل الله والذين كفروا يقاتلون في سبيل الطاغوت. Okay, so over here fake gods is used as a translation for Taghut. Those who have faith fight in the way of Allah, and those who are faithless fight in the way of fake gods. Then what does it go on to say, the verse? So fight the friends of shaitan. Okay? Fake gods, Taghut, who are they? Friends of shaitan. All those, again, a reference to all those external forces which take us away from the divine movement and the divine symbols of the movement. What's also very important to remember is the Quran is not just a book of scaring us. There's a bit of motivation in this verse as well, although it's not directly linked to our discussion, but it's always good to mention those things as well. Because the discussion, if I'm able to survive by the end of this, it gets slightly scary. This verse in itself, it finishes off by saying, so fight the friends of shaitan. Indeed, the stratagems or strategy of shaitan, the strategies of shaitan are always flimsy. Inna kayda shaitan kana za'ifa. Right? Flimsy, weak, however you want to translate it. So, like, don't worry, you can take him on. It's not as scary or as big as it initially appears. Okay? So that's generally like what Taghut is. Like, just to have a very simple understanding, that's what Taghut is. Now, what is the problem of being attached to this line? This is where it starts to get scary, and then I'm going to leave you guys with a question, which is very scary, but inshallah I won't have to answer it, because I don't want to get in trouble. Ayatollah Khamenei mentions the first problem, or one of the biggest problems of falling in the line of following the Taghut, is that once you take a step towards him, the Taghut does not let you go until it completely and utterly controls every single part of your existence. Until it is able to absolutely and utterly rinse and destroy you, make as much use of you as possible. It does not suffice with you just, I don't know, lying once to your friend. It's like, no, okay, lying to your tomorrow you'll be lying to your parents. The day after you'll be, I don't know, lying for something else. Until eventually you'll reach a stage where you'll be lying to the Imam of the time. You'll be the responsible, your lies will be responsible for the mu'mineen getting into trouble, and so on and so forth. Right? That's how it works. This is shown in the Quran, again Surah An-Nisa, verse 115. Whoever defies the apostle after the guidance has become manifest to him, and follows a way other than that of the faithful. So divine movement, divine symbols of that movement, he follows a way other than that of the faithful. SubhanAllah. We shall abandon him to his devices, and we shall make him enter hell. Who's speaking over here? This is Allah speaking, right? So it's not like it's not even so much so that the Taghut like drags them down and keeps dragging them down and keeps dragging it. No, the way that the system of Allah works is when he's saying like, what's it called? We shall abandon him to his devices, that's what happens. It's like, okay, you veer off this path, you're not under our protection anymore. In a way, whatever happens to you just happens. And honestly, you know, we have traditions which say that if it wasn't for the Imam of our time, the lovers of the Ahlul Bayt would be finished right now. There wouldn't be, and it's true, we've been through the whole, like, you know, quick history of the lovers of the Ahlul Bayt. It's true. Our existence goes beyond the calculations, the normal calculations of the sociologists and the historians, that we should not have existed, let alone being in a position of so much strength. But as soon as we veer off from that path, what happens? That protection goes away. And once that protection is not there, yeah, we'll just keep on falling and utter destruction and so on and so forth. We shall make him enter hell, and it is an evil destination. The example that he uses over here is of a gushing river. It's like you see a river in front of you that has a very strong current. I'm giving the editing team here a lot of work. I hope to not see those coughs on YouTube. So you see a river in front of you and it's flowing. It's like, I'm just going to make my hand wet. It's like, that's not how a very fast flowing river works. You put your hand inside it, all of you is going to go, and you'll go. You'll go. Initially, you may get a few bruises here and there, but you'll stay in that and you'll keep on going until eventually, like, your head hits somewhere and that's it. You're gone, finished. Like, you're completely dead. Like, that's the example he uses. That's what going into the Wilayah of the Ta'ud is. Another very good example is that of Zubair. Right? Like, it's so important that we keep reminding ourselves of these examples. We've spoken about them. It's the same story. Look, Zubair, this guy who was praised by the Prophet. The Prophet said about him, until the sword of Zubair is with Islam, no harm can come to it. Right? That's not a small praise. Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salam, says about Zubair that there was nothing left between Zubair becoming a part of the Ahlul Bayt. Like we have traditions about Salman, for example. That's how high his status was. But what happened? It started with this small jealousy that was in his heart. But rather than fighting against that weakness, rather than getting rid of that weakness that existed within him, it grew. Slowly his son came along and he started whispering in his ears. Slowly that grew. What happened? Shaitan wasn't just going to be happy with, oh, Zubair, he's nearly a part of the Ahlul Bayt, I'm just going to make him like feel this slight thing in his heart. Where did he end up? He ended up going so far that he fought against Imam Ali, so he wanted to kill him. Ibn Muljam is another great example. The reason why Ibn Muljam was in Kufa was because in Yemen, so he was from Yemen, they wanted to give their allegiance to Amir al-Mu'mineen. And they, like the Yemenis, have always known to be loyal to Amir al-Mu'mineen. They couldn't figure out how they would give this allegiance, so they're like, we want to give this allegiance in the best form possible. So among like the best of them, they chose like the 100 best. And then they narrowed it down to like the 20 best. And then they narrowed it down to like the 5 best. And then out of those 5, Ibn Muljam was selected as the truest and best lover of Amir al-Mu'mineen and like Muslim and so on and so forth. And he went to Kufa to give that allegiance. On the way, when he was supposed to return, he missed his caravan. Right? Look at where he ended up. If I'm not mistaken, it was because of a lady, like the lust he felt towards a woman. Right? Shaitan isn't just going to be content with looking at an al-mahram in the wrong way. Right? No, he wants you. That's just the entrance. He wants you to take it down the route where ultimately, what is his objective? Harm reaching the divine movement or the divine symbols of the movement. That's what he wants you to do. A lot of the times, the question is raised, as a side point, the question is raised, why does Islam have ahkam on the level of halal and haram on very small things? Right? Okay, we understand like alcohol, like you can't drink alcohol. But seriously, I can't even sit on the table where alcohol is being served. Why? Because the way that shaitan is to counter that, ultimately. The shaitan is going to come in from somewhere. What Islam does is it tries to block off that channel from the start, so that he's not able to come in. Because once that happens, there's a saying that one of the famous speakers in Pakistan says. He says, whenever anyone asks him a question like this and think, why do we have to do this? I understand we can't, have a relationship with a non-mahram before it's halal basically. But why can't we shake their hands? And he responds, anyone who asks a question like this, he always responds by saying, it always starts with orange juice. Because he knew of a story of a guy who was so adamant that there's nothing wrong with drinking orange juice. And this guy was religious, super religious discipline. And he saw nothing wrong with drinking orange juice alongside his friends who were drinking alcohol in the pub. But the day came where from that orange juice, it transformed into having an alcoholic drink. And subhanAllah, the way that shaitan works, not only did he start drinking alcohol, he became known as the drunkard of that group. Why? Because, okay, if he just became an alcohol, would that really have damaged the divine movement or the divine symbols of that movement? But now it's like, oh, look, these guys, Muslims, yeah, look at him. He's worse than us. That starts hurting the divine movement. Umar ibn Sa'd, again, very good example. There's a famous story that I've heard from Agha Panahiyan, in which he says that Umar ibn Sa'd actually used to be very close to Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein. They grew up playing together, to the extent that one day, when they were young, Umar ibn Sa'd came into the house of Imam Hussein, and he said to Imam Hussein, there's some crazy people outside who are saying that I'm going to be the reason for your death. And like, ha ha ha. Right? Imam Hussein said to him, and this is the first time like we have it recorded as well, said to him that all I'm saying is you're not going to live long after me. If you remember on the day of Ashura, Imam Hussein reminded him. He said, remember what I told you that day, that you're not going to live long after me. You know, you have to look at those small things which were there in Umar ibn Sa'd. For example, that hubb dunya that existed within him. It's not just going to be about, oh, like, I really like this land called, Ray. Even though that was a much more developed, desire that he had. But it's never just going to be about that. So, I'm going to use this desire of yours in a way that you become my tool for the death of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. One of the issues with falling off the path of the Wilayah of the divine is you don't think you're doing something wrong. You start off small. It's like, why is this a problem? Is it really a problem that you're not accepting the authority of Allah? You're not accepting the guardianship of Allah in your lives on this level. Is it really a problem? And then when the Imam comes back, we have traditions which say that the Shia will say, what kind of a religion is this? To the Imam of the time. Right? You have to think how's that going to happen? How is it that the Shia or the people of Kufa ultimately didn't help Imam Hussein alayhi salam? And the people of Kufa are a very good example for this. And Ayatollah Khamna in the book actually uses that. He goes through a little, a small history of the people of Kufa. There's one specific extract I'm going to take from there. It was a relationship that they had with Hajjaj. Right? Remember, Kufa was... Kufa was not like any other city. Not even Medina had as many followers of the Ahlul Bayt in Kufa. There's a reason why Imam Ali ﷺ established his government in Kufa. Why? Because that's where his supporters were, that's where his followers were. Anyways, fast forward to the time of Marwan, when Marwan was Khalif. He sent Hajjaj to the people of Kufa. Hajjaj, he sat on the minbar. No one stopped him. He sat on the pulpit. People could see there's some random person sitting on the pulpit. No one stopped him and asked, who are you? This in itself is a very important lesson for us. It was almost an expectation in that time that the only people who could even think about sitting on a minbar, this is not a minbar, it's a normal chair, on a minbar, would be those who are recognized as something. Unlike what's happened these days, where you have random people coming and sitting on chairs. The point is, he sat on that pulpit. They didn't recognize who it was, but no one stopped him. No one asked who he was. In fact, when they saw that there's someone on the pulpit, he actually had his turban on and he had his face covered. When they saw someone was on the pulpit, they all gathered even closer together. Oh, someone's on the pulpit, let's see what he has to say, kind of thing. When Hajjaj realized he had the attention of the people, he took his covering off and he introduced himself. He says, I'm Hajjaj. And everyone knew who Hajjaj was. Hajjaj was Marwan's guy, right? They knew who he was. It wasn't like some random person. No, they knew who he was. No one stopped him. He asked his slave to read a letter for them. And the way he asked the slave was, he said, read the letter that I got from Amir al-Mu'mineen Marwan. No one stopped him. Everyone knew who that title belonged to. There's a reason why Hajjaj used it. No one stopped him. So his servant started reading the letter. Began the letter, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In that letter, Marwan sends his salam to the people of Kufa. And then his servant, like after he sends the salam, he wanted to continue. Hajjaj stopped it. He's like, no. And he told the people of Kufa off. Wait, what's wrong with you? Amir al-Mu'mineen Marwan sends the salam and you're just going to stay quiet? Start again. So his servant started the letter again. And when he got to the point where he says, Marwan sending him salam to the people of Kufa, they all responded to his salam. They said, if I'm not, like the exact words were like, I think I'm write it down. Wa Amir al-Mu'mineen salam. This is the people of Kufa, the ones who were the closest to the Ahlul Bayt. You have to try and figure out, what is this attachment that they had with the Ahlul Bayt at the first place? What's the quality of this attachment that they had with the Ahlul Bayt at the first place, that they are now happy with having an attachment with the Taghut? This is attachment to the Taghut. Please recite salawat. Should I carry on? How long has it been, by the way? Half hour? Okay, I'm going to mention some points quickly and then inshallah we'll wrap up. 45 minutes? It's been 45 minutes? Oh wow. Okay, someone's du'as are working. I did not realize I'd actually survived this long. Okay. The people of Kufa, when Hajjaj had this or built this relationship with them, they became one of the safest places for the Tawaghit. So they started from where? And they ended up reaching where? Surah Nisa, verse 119. This is Shaitan talking now. Surah Nisa, verse 119. And I will lead them astray and give them false hopes and prompt them to slit the ears of the cattle, and I will prompt them to alter Allah's creation. Whoever takes Shaitan as a guardian, as a wali, instead of Allah, has certainly incurred a manifest loss. Okay, so it's specifically talking about the guardianship of other than Allah. Question. I will lead them astray. I will give them false hopes. And the worst thing of all, prompt them to slit the ears of cattle. What does that mean? Why is that the worst thing?
Then you belong to them.
Sorry?
Then you belong to him.
But what's this a reference to? Slitting the ears of a cattle. Like not even like, murdering a person or something. It's like literally just taking a bit of the ear of a cattle. Do you know what this is a reference to? No? You do?
I'm not going to say.
You're not going to say it? Why?
You should say.
Okay. You may be right, I may be wrong. But I doubt Ayatollah Khamenei will be wrong. So what he says is again what Shaitan is saying, that look, yeah, I'll start off by just leading them astray. Give them false hopes. I wish we had time just to open that up in itself. Give them false hope. That's the next stage of where he's going to take them now. And where are they going to end up? Slitting the ears of cattle. Right. Slitting the ears of cattle was one of the practices in superstitions that the Arabs used to do in the age of Jahiliyyah. So what is Shaitan saying to them? I won't just lead them astray. I won't just give them false hopes. But I will ruin them to such an extent that they will go back to their old ways. That's what it's a reference to. He'll start over there, but he will take them all the way down.